In this video, we're going to be talking about the material and summarizing the material in Chapter 8, which is the start of a new section. If you look in the table of contents of the textbook, this is the start of section of the course on business cycles. When we started the course, we were talking about how to measure economic activity and some brief overview of macroeconomics more generally. And then we talked about the long run economy and long run economic growth and the economy in the long run. So chapters 3 through 7 have really focused on the long run. Chapters 8 and 9 are going to focus on business cycles. And this is the first of those two chapters that we're going to focus on, dealing with business cycle behavior. Really, we can think about an intermediate macroeconomics course or a principles of macroeconomics course is composed really of two big topics: the long run growth of the economy and a market-based economy, and business cycles around that long run economic growth. Ultimately, living standards are determined by the long run growth of the economy. That's why we tend to spend more time on that, but also to set a groundwork, a framework for talking about macroeconomic behavior more generally in the economy. When we talk about business cycles, we're going to be talking about deviations away from that long run economic growth. We call recessions and expansions. We generally are fluctuating around the long run growth of real GDP in the economy. One of the questions we'll ask is, so when we're away from that long run trend, in particular when we're in a recession, what might be done or what should be done, if anything, to try and move the economy back to its long run trend, back to full employment? We normally think of being on the long run trend as being at full employment, and how that full employment level of real GDP changes over time. So let's go to the book and take a look at that and how what's covered in this chapter in introducing this particular topic. So let's go to the table of contents in Chapter 8. You'll see that Chapter 8 is made up of 4 different sections. There's an introduction overall to business cycles, as there's an introduction in each chapter. And then we'll talk about, well, what do we mean by a business cycle? And the sort of 2 parts that deal with the data of the economy are sections 2 and 3 in this chapter. What's been the historical record within the US? And then what are what we call the business cycle facts? What's the behavior of a whole wide variety of macroeconomic variables in the economy over time? And that's what we call the business cycle facts. And then there's an introduction at the very end. It's a brief section. It's an introduction related to the material that's in Chapter 9, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which you actually saw in a principles of macroeconomics class. So we're actually getting to that point, and we're going to see in Chapter 9 that aggregate demand, aggregate supply model really comes out of the other markets that we have looked at: the labor market, the production function, the goods market, and the money market or the asset market. So we'll get a brief introduction at the end of this chapter. So the learning objectives for this whole chapter, and those are listed at the beginning of every chapter in the book. So that's no different here. So we have an introductory section, just kind of giving an overview. Goes back actually to Chapter 2 when we talk about classical and Keynesian. It looks like Keynesians, but it's Keynes, John Maynard Keynes. It's Keynesian economics and classical economics. So the basic difference between them is that classical economists believe that prices adjust quickly in the economy, prices and wages. Keynesians believe that prices and wages are sticky or don't adjust very quickly. And the implications of that for our model and for economic behavior are significantly different. So in this chapter, I want to lay out, well, what do the actual data look like, and which model, the classical model or the Keynesian model, which assumptions seem to do a better job of explaining what we call the business cycle facts, right? The actual economic data of the US economy. We could use other economies, but we're in the US, so we use the US economy. So, so what's a business cycle? That's the first part of this chapter. It's actually part of the work that I did on my dissertation when I was getting my PhD, the work of Arthur Burns and also Wesley Mitchell, Burns and Mitchell. That's actually was part of the subject of my dissertation when I got my PhD. They were doing work back in 1946. No, I wasn't even born yet then. But I was actually using part of their book, Measuring Business Cycles, and some modern statistical techniques, and some that I developed myself to look at the work that they did and through a new lens. So this is the basic definition that Burns and Mitchell have. I suggest you take a look at that in that first section because it really does describe what it is that we're talking about. It's still the definition that's used today. So in this case, I'll just read it because it's that important. The type of fluctuation found in aggregate economic activity of nations that organize their work mainly in business enterprises, market-based economies. Cycle, a business cycle consists of expansions occurring at about the same time in many economic activities, followed by similarly general recessions, contractions, and revivals, again, in many different economic activities at the same time, and which then merge into the expansion phase of the next cycle, right? So ups and downs in the economy, right? And it goes on and on. The sequence of changes is recurrent. It goes on and repeats, but isn't of a certain length. It's not periodic in the sense of one cycle, one business cycle, or one expansion is 5 years and the next one's 5 years. No, one might be 5 years, another one might be 10 years. It depends, right? And it says business cycles, that is an expansion and a contraction or a recession, and go anywhere from typically from 1 to 10 or 12 years. They vary in length. And then in this chapter, they talk about the rest of all the different points in this definition. What do we mean by aggregate economic activity, expansions and contractions, etc.? And so this is a stylized picture of what we're talking about here. Here would be the growth path, say, of real GDP over time. And the actual economy, right? Aggregate economic activity. Oftentimes we use real GDP, but it doesn't have to be that. Is fluctuating around that long run growth, right? And so we have periods of expansion in the economy, followed by contractions, again, followed by expansions, right? Ups and downs. So those are what we call business cycles, right? And we go through the rest of that definition. Each one of those sentences in that definition, right, back up here, all right, that Burns and Mitchell were looking at back in the 1940s, following the Great Depression, in the decade after that, right, every one of those sentences, every one of those phrases is important. So that's really what the very first section is about. It's not a long section, but it's important to spend some time really understanding each piece of that. The second section of the chapter has to do with, well, so what does the actual record look like in terms of business cycles? And so they give you different kinds of different turning points. The National Bureau of Economic Research is a group. It's a group of economists that determines when a business cycle peak has happened. In other words, the start of a recession. And when the trough has happened, that is when we're starting the expansion. Usually happens after the fact, right? But there's a group of economists that do that. And you can see that here are the expansion periods, the time between the trough and a peak, and here are the months between a peak and the next trough, right? So that's a contraction or a recession. And you can see they vary in length, right? But as we get closer to the present, right, if we keep going forward, it's like this is the whole shooting works, right? If we get closer to the present, you can see that those contractions actually get shorter, right? 8, 10, 12 months compared to back here, sometimes 24. We're back in the 1870s, sometimes 32, right? 65. You generally don't see the Great Depression, 43, and again, another one in the early, also in the 30s, beginning of the 30s, as well as the later part of the 30s. 2 of them during that period of time, during that decade. Right? They're longer, but as we get closer to the present, the expansions, some of them get really long, right? This is the longer, some of the longest ones um, uh, uh, in history, right, that we've seen. And then in the rest of this, and there are reasons for this. So a question should be like, wow, what causes these really long expansions? And then why are these recessions pretty short and shorter than they used to be? Expansions and recessions used to be look a bit more like each other, right? Oftentimes the recessions were longer than the expansions, right? But they're very similar. You didn't see those long expansions generally. World War II, this one, 1938, 80, like 7 years roughly, right? Well, there's a reason, and partly because we were at war. That can be a good thing for the economy, even though as long as the war is not in your economy. So we want to ask questions about that. That's one of the things that should kind of tweak your curiosity. And so in this section of chapter 8, we're going to go through each one of the authors go through each one of these historical periods, right? World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. Right around World War II, following the Great Depression, that's when Burns and Mitchell are working in the 1940s. We really start looking at the macroeconomy and thinking about how we can measure that economy, and want to measure it because we want to be able to see, maybe there's something we can do about things like the Great Depression, recessions, and get the economy back to full employment. So we need to be able to measure where the economy is in order to do that. That was really the start of Keynesian economics. That's when he was writing, and the role for government intervening in the economy to help give the economy a boost through fiscal policy really started to take off. So we can go again post-World War II, and what business cycles since then have been like, since 1945-ish, right? And so there's a long section. Obviously, that's a good chunk of time. Let's see, remember, we're moving toward the present. So we're talking about some longer expansions, right? And shorter recessions. Then we get to the Great Recession, right? In 2007, 2008, and then the expansion since then, right? And then this question, well, have U.S. business cycles become less severe in the U.S. economy or not? And economists have done work on that. Christina Romer and others have done work on that. That part of the argument has been like, yes, yes, they have gotten less variable, right? You can see this variation in GDP growth back here, back to the 1950s, and you can see that variation in GDP growth has gotten less variable. The variance has gotten smaller in recent years. So the question is, why might that be? So that's something to think about. Think about volatility of these different measures, right? And so the standard deviations, right? And you can see there's the higher these are, the more variation there is, and that has gone down, except again for the Great Recession here. But generally, that variation has gone down. Oftentimes, people would refer to economic policy by the Federal Reserve, by the federal government, as being one of the reasons for that reduced variability. So, interesting question: do economic expansions die of old age? Right? Is there something that when an economic expansion starts to go on and on and on, is there something that is likely to cause that expansion to end and for a new recession to start? So the answer is generally no to that. And again, you can see the time period matters here. So since post-war, since 1945 in particular, right, as the age of a expansion has gotten longer. The probability, right, the probability in percent terms that the expansion will end in the next month, stays pretty low. That didn't used to be the case, but certainly since the 1940s or so, last 80 years, 75 years or so, that's generally been the case. So generally, economists don't believe that economists just die of old age. There are reasons why that happens. In our case, COVID, most recently. Section 8.3 is the biggest chunk here. And all it does is goes through a whole variety of different economic variables. Remember Burns and Mitchell in that first part of the chapter saying it's co-movement, ups and downs, and lots of different activities in the economy at the same time. So that's what this section is trying to lay out and trying to show that, yes, there are lots of different things, whether it's production or prices, whether it's employment, whether it's the unemployment rate, et cetera. These things tend to move together, right? Sometimes in the same direction, sometimes in opposite directions. For example, when the economy is doing really well, GDP is going up, real GDP, but the unemployment rate is going down, right? So sometimes they move in opposite directions, but they're moving together in that regard. So we talk about direction and timing. Are they pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical? Are they moving with the cycle or against the cycle? Unemployment rate would be one of them that's moving opposite from the cycle, right? When the economy is going up, unemployment rate is going down, but employment is pro-cyclical. It's going up when the economy is doing better. Sometimes some of the variables, some of the economic variables lag in the economy. Employment oftentimes is a lagging variable, or unemployment rate is a lagging variable. It takes a while for businesses to be confident, for example, that a business cycle expansion is happening before they really start hiring lots of workers. So the expansion may be starting, spending may be increasing, real GDP may be increasing before you see a boost in employment, and in particular, a reduction in the unemployment rate. So that's what this section is all about. It goes through production. You can use the industrial production index, or you can use real GDP. And so here's a whole slew of different kinds of macroeconomic variables, and whether they're classified as pro-cyclical or coincident. And you could talk about lagging and leading as well, right? That's what the coincident means, or the timing. I'm sorry, timing in terms of whether they go exactly with the cycle, or whether they start to move ahead of the cycle, or whether they lag a little bit. And you can see that most of the variables that we care about in the economy are actually, excuse me, pro-cyclical. Right, they move with the economy. That's what Burns and Mitchell were talking about. That's what they looked when they looked at data for the U.S. economy. That's what they saw. They were the first ones to really look at that in depth. What we're going to be doing in our FRED project is we're going to be looking at, we're going to have a selection of these variables that are discussed here in Chapter 8. We're going to have you look at their behavior, essentially the graphs that are here in Chapter 8 and Section 8.3, and have you think about summarizing them. And create a dashboard online at the Federal Reserve Economic Data site at the St. Louis Federal Reserve. And then you're going to use that later on in the course to develop our macroeconomic briefing report, which is going to come at the end of the course, kind of pull everything together. So this is an opportunity where we start looking at that and look at the business cycle behavior of these economic variables. So we have data on expenditures, employment, unemployment. We have on productivity, the real wage, money growth, inflation, right? Financial variables like interest rates, nominal interest rates, international variables in this case, production across, you can see that across different industrialized countries, things are at different levels, but they tend to move up and down together. Business cycles across the world tend to move up and down together. We could look at trade deficits. We could look at other kinds of international data. All these things are going to give us clues as to what's happening in the economy. They also form the basis for testing our economic theories. To be a good theory, the theory has to be able to explain the economic data. So this section in particular is all about the economic data, right? And so do our economic theories allow us to predict, explain the behavior of those economic variables? Would you expect, for example, from our theory that employment and real GDP would move together, the unemployment rate would go in the opposite direction, that spending by consumers would tend to be pro-cyclical and move in the same direction as GDP? And the answer, a lot of this already, is yes. And we're going to put that all together. So ultimately, we're in chapter 9, we'll be able to ask the question, well, which model does a better job? The Keynesian model, the classical model? What assumptions tend to do a better job of explaining that table back there of data and pro-cyclical data, whether it lags or leads? In particular, is the data pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical or acyclical? And so we want to test that data and those business cycle facts, right, against what the theory predicts. And that's what we're going to be doing in chapter 9. The last section of chapter 8 is an introduction to that model, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. We're going to develop something called the ISLM-FE. IS, investment and saving, that's the goods market. LM is liquidity in the money market. So that has to, and then FE has to do with full employment, the labor market, and the production function. We're going to put all those in one graph, right? And then aggregate demand, aggregate supply, it comes out of the ISLM-FE model. So the last section of chapter 8 discusses aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and gives an introduction about how we can use that model to explain, right, economic data in the economy. And it talks about it in terms of the Keynesian and classical models and how we can account for different assumptions about price level flexibility, wage flexibility, which is the main distinction between Keynesian and classical models. And we can use this model to try and help explain what's going on in the actual economy in terms of business cycles. Up till now, we've been talking about long-run economic growth, but here we're going to be able to talk about what causes the economy to move away from full employment and to be in a recession, or what might cause inflation, what might cause the economy to overheat, be beyond the level of real GDP that we associate with full employment. So our model is going to be able to help really understand not only the long-run economic growth, but deviations away from that long-run economic growth. And then what we should do in terms of policy, if anything. Should the federal government do anything in terms of fiscal policy, taxes, and government spending? Should the Federal Reserve do anything in terms of changing the interest rate and the money supply in order to try and move the economy one way or the other in terms of the business cycle? That's what we hear. That's really what we hear about most in the news and in the discussion board posts that you're doing. They're really mainly about the business cycle, the day-to-day, week-to-week, even month-to-month variations in the economy. That's the model that we're developing here in this last, or discussing in this last section of chapter 8. So it's really a bridge between the work that we've been doing earlier in the course, talking about the long run, and in chapter 9, we're going to be able to have a full business cycle model using the tools that we developed earlier in the course from chapter 3 on, and also providing the grounding in the data that the models need to explain. So take some time to read through this chapter and really kind of stop along the way to get a good understanding of each one of the sections. It will help you in material in chapter 9, where we'll spend a couple of weeks on that chapter. It's pretty dense with a lot of material. Everything kind of comes together there. And so we'll spend more time on that.